In 1978, Copper Falls was the kind of town people moved to when they wanted to disappear from the chaos of the world. Surrounded by dense forests and quiet roads, it was a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Generations had lived there without seeing much change. Children played in the streets, doors were left unlocked at night, and everyone knew everyone else. It was a town of trust and routine, until that summer shattered everything. The first girl to disappear was 16-year-old Emily Carter. She had walked home from a friend's house late one evening and never arrived. At first, the town thought she'd run away. But Emily wasn't the type. She was close with her parents, good in school, and had dreams of going to college. Her disappearance sparked concern, but without any witnesses or signs of struggle, police could only speculate. They searched the roadsides and combed the woods, but Emily was simply gone. 3 weeks later, another girl vanished, 14-year-old Hannah Bell. She'd gone out to pick blackberries behind her family's farmhouse and never came back. Her basket was found tipped over near the edge of the forest, berries spilled across the dirt. Again, no prints, no signs of violence, just silence. By then, the town was afraid. Parents kept their kids indoors, schools canceled after-hour events, and the sheriff's department doubled patrols. But they were grasping in the dark. Nothing pointed to who, or what, was behind it. The final disappearance hit the town like a thunderclap. Rebecca Lane, 17 years old, was last seen walking her dog near the creek that ran behind the local church. The dog returned home hours later, covered in mud, leash dragging behind him, but Rebecca never did. It was the last straw. A town that once trusted its peace now flinched at every shadow. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said it was a drifter. Others blamed a reclusive trapper who lived near the ridge. Every outsider was a suspect, but no evidence ever surfaced. The trail remained cold, the forest quiet, and the fear constant. The investigations stalled. Leads dried up. Theories multiplied but never led anywhere real. Time passed, and with it, hope began to fade. Grief settled into daily life. Memorials were placed at the edge of the woods. Families moved away, unable to live under the weight of unanswered questions. A once vibrant town became cautious, quiet, changed forever. The 3 girls' photos hung on the bulletin board at the sheriff's station for years, faces frozen in time. No charges were ever filed. No bodies were ever found. The case files were eventually boxed up and sent into storage, labeled unsolved. And just like that, what had once been the town's nightmare faded into legend. Stories of the missing girls of Copper Falls were passed down to new generations, but few believed justice would ever come. What no one knew then was that a single mistake, something small, almost invisible, had been left behind. And decades later, that forgotten clue would finally bring the truth back to light. Rachel Myers had only been working at the Oregon State Records Department for 6 months when she was assigned to digitize the archives from closed cases in rural counties. It wasn't glamorous work, just hours of scanning yellowed papers and organizing decades-old files no one had touched in years. Most boxes were filled with routine material, minor thefts, old court documents, case notes with dust so thick it coated her fingers. But then she opened one labeled, Copper Falls, closed, and everything changed. Inside, the box looked ordinary. Loose folders, faded photographs, a hand-drawn map on crinkled paper. But nestled between 2 case reports was something unusual, a small cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, unlabeled. It felt oddly out of place. The tape wasn't listed in the evidence log stapled to the inside of the file. Next to it, sealed in a decades-old evidence bag, was a single cigarette butt. Someone had written, "Found near Site 2, in red ink across the bag. Out of curiosity more than anything else, Rachel borrowed an old cassette player from the media department and popped the tape in. For nearly a minute, all she heard was static. She almost stopped it, until a man's voice broke through. It was calm, steady, almost bored. But what he said sent chills down her spine. He spoke about the forest, about choosing carefully. He described a creek, a trailhead, and how they never screamed. There were no names, no dates, just a man reliving his crimes like they were memories of a vacation. His tone was chillingly detached, like he was talking about building a bookshelf or fixing a car. Rachel listened, frozen, unable to stop. It wasn't just creepy, It was specific. There were locations mentioned, ones that matched the map in the box. There was emotion, but not remorse, pride. When the tape ended, Rachel sat in silence, heart pounding. She knew this was more than a curiosity. She flagged her supervisor, and the box was immediately transferred to the State Cold Case Division. The audio was analyzed, and investigators confirmed what she suspected. It was a confession. A real one. What made it remarkable wasn't just the tape itself, but the level of detail. Whoever recorded it had been there. He mentioned turning off the trail after the fifth marker, burying something near a tree struck by lightning. These weren't things someone could make up without being involved. And now, after decades, they had something solid, a voice, a location, and a clue that had gone untouched for 45 years. But the biggest break came when the lab tested the cigarette. Technology that hadn't existed in the 70s made quick work of the dried tobacco. The DNA on the filter was clean and strong. Within days, the database returned a hit, a man living in Northern California under a different name. He had no criminal record, but he had a secret. The voice on the tape matched him exactly. The past, long buried, had finally come knocking. The name that came back from the DNA database was Walter Renner. On paper, he was unremarkable, a retired dock worker living a quiet life in Crescent Bay, California. He was 83 years old, had no living relatives, and had spent the last 4 decades blending into the background. His house was modest, his habits predictable. Neighbors described him as polite, private, and boring. But the DNA didn't lie. The saliva on the cigarette matched him exactly, and so did the voice from the cassette tape. Authorities now knew who the killer was. What they didn't know yet was how he had disappeared so completely after 1978. A deeper dive into public records revealed a more disturbing truth. There was no record of a Walter Renner before 1980. No birth certificate, no tax returns, no school or medical records. He seemed to appear out of nowhere. Investigators followed the thread back and found a series of forged documents, social security paperwork, a driver's license with doctored information, even a false employment history. It was all expertly done, but sloppy in hindsight. Whoever he had been before, he had erased it carefully. And he had succeeded for 45 years. But there were gaps. A house purchased in cash. A bank account opened with no co-signers. A curious lack of personal connections. All things that had once seemed harmless were now suspicious. Federal agents quietly surveilled the house while local police obtained a warrant. When they moved in, there was no resistance. Walter Renner, or whoever he had been before, answered the door calmly. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't speak at all. They took him into custody, and he never asked a single question. Back at the station, facial recognition software did something stunning. It matched Walter Renner to a missing person from 1979, a man named Raymond Talbot. Talbot had been a suspect in an assault case in Oregon, but had vanished before charges were ever filed. The case had gone cold, and his name faded from the radar. But now it was clear. Talbot hadn't vanished, he had transformed. As the pieces came together, authorities realized something chilling. The disappearances in Copper Falls had stopped precisely when Raymond Talbot disappeared. The last girl vanished in late July 1978. By the time August rolled around, the killings had stopped, and Talbot was gone. It hadn't been a coincidence, it had been a calculated exit. For years, Talbot had lived in a shell of a new identity, hiding behind time and routine. He had worked just enough to stay unnoticed, paid taxes, never traveled, and never got arrested. He had lived as a ghost in a world that never questioned him. But the smallest of things, a cigarette flicked away in the woods nearly half a century earlier, had opened the door to his undoing. Now, sitting in a windowless room under bright fluorescent lights, Talbot faced the weight of his past. A man who had believed he'd buried his sins deep enough to forget them was finally being remembered. The tape had described the burial sites with unnerving precision. While the original investigation had covered the general area around Copper Falls, the specific trail mentioned on the cassette had long since become overgrown and forgotten. But with the hand-drawn map found in the old case file, investigators now had a guide, one made by the killer himself. It was eerie how the map matched the tape's directions. Every turn, every marker, even the crooked tree struck by lightning decades ago, though aged and split, was still standing. A forensic team, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, spent several days sweeping the area. Deep in the forest, at a location labeled Site 1, they found the first grave. Just below the surface, carefully arranged stones concealed what appeared to be human remains. The soil was different here, looser, disrupted. A test confirmed it was a grave. As the sun set that evening, a small white tent was erected over the spot. The next morning, the team returned and unearthed the skeleton of a teenage girl. Dental records and DNA confirmed what many feared. It was Emily Carter, the first girl to vanish in the summer of 1978. 2 days later, Site 2 yielded the second body. Hannah Bell. Her remains were more scattered, possibly disturbed by animals over time, but again, the DNA confirmed the identity. With each discovery, the town of Copper Falls was pulled back into a nightmare they had tried for decades to forget. For the families who had stayed, the grief was raw and fresh, as if no time had passed at all. Site 3 was the hardest to reach, nestled behind a dry creek bed and hidden under a dense patch of brambles. Beneath the soil lay the final girl, Rebecca Lane. Her remains were remarkably preserved, possibly due to the clay-like consistency of the earth around her grave. A silver bracelet on her wrist, tarnished but intact, helped confirm her identity even before DNA testing was completed. The horror of it all was amplified by the methodical way the sites had been prepared. Each grave was marked, not with a headstone, but with subtle symbols carved into nearby tree trunks, symbols that matched those scribbled in the margins of the killer's old map. It was as if he wanted to return one day, or at least ensure that if someone did find them, they would know it had all been intentional. News of the discovery spread quickly. National outlets picked up the story, a 45-year-old cold case, cracked open by an old tape and a cigarette. For many, it was a chilling reminder that evil could hide in plain sight for years. For Copper Falls, it was a moment of tragic closure. The girls had been found, but their innocence, along with the town's, had been buried forever. In prison, Raymond Talbot remained silent. But when shown the photographs of the uncovered graves, his expression finally cracked. A flicker of recognition. Not shock. Not denial. Just quiet acknowledgement. The forest had finally given up its secrets, and the truth was no longer his to hide. Raymond Talbot sat in the sterile holding cell of the Crescent Bay Detention Center, silent and still. He had not spoken a word since his arrest. Despite the mounting evidence, the photographs, the DNA, and the voice on the tape, he showed no emotion. His face remained blank during interviews, his gaze distant and cold. For the detectives watching him, it was like trying to read a statue. But then came the moment they had waited for, the confrontation with his own voice. A small monitor was wheeled into the room. The audio was queued up to play through a speaker fixed above the table. As the first static-filled seconds played, Talbot didn't flinch. But then the voice started. Calm, calculated, almost casual. The voice spoke about the first girl, how she had walked through the woods, how he had followed her without being seen. It was the exact tape Rachel Myers had found in the records box. The voice on the tape was his own. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then, as the voice described the placement of the second body, a tremor moved through Talbot's hand. He clenched his fingers and shifted slightly in his seat. He didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't confess, but something inside him had shifted. The mask had cracked. For the first time in 45 years, he knew without a doubt that he had been caught. And not by accident. Not by luck. By time, and his own arrogance. He had made the tape all those years ago as a trophy, a way to preserve his triumphs without risk of exposure. He believed it would remain buried with the rest of the forgotten evidence, safe behind bureaucracy and decay. But time had changed everything. A piece of trash, a discarded cigarette, had become the key to his undoing. DNA had caught up with him, and the voice he thought no one would ever hear had become the final nail in the coffin. In court, Talbot's legal team entered a plea of not guilty. It was procedural, expected. But everyone knew it was over. The prosecution brought out the physical evidence, the forensic matches, the recovered remains, and the voice on the tape. Experts confirmed that the voice print matched his precisely. There was no room for doubt. The trial was short. Jurors sat in stunned silence as the audio played in court. Family members of the victims wept. Others simply stared, numb, as the past replayed in chilling detail. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Talbot barely reacted. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No chance of escape. No more hiding behind a new name. After the sentencing, he was transported to a maximum security facility, his final destination. In the quiet of his cell, surrounded by concrete and steel, Raymond Talbot was no longer a shadow, no longer invisible. He was known, identified, remembered for what he had done. Justice had finally arrived, not with noise, but with the slow, relentless steps of time, science, and a forgotten voice that refused to stay buried.